Great. Thank you so much, Diane. It's great to be here with everybody, and I'm going to try and not take your paper.
Yeah, thanks.
Because every time I come up to a podium, I end up walking away with the previous speaker's paper. Hope everybody's well. Wow, what a week, huh? Here we are in beautiful Yountville, and hello to all the city officials especially, but all the local officials and our guests and other speakers. We started off the week, all of us and still are very concerned about Haiti, and hearing story after story about the courage and the dangers and the terrible challenges that the people of Haiti are facing, and what our country and other countries are doing to try and help them. So we all know that what's going on here today, we're going to focus on, but the bigger concerns are there. Then we had this really interesting political development on Tuesday in one state that seems to have been caused a tectonic change in the political mood of the country. We now have Democratic members of our congressional delegation saying they can't vote for a health care bill. Who would have predicted that even a week ago? And every bill apparently that comes out of Congress is going to deal with jobs. Now, what does that have to do with why we're here today? I think it's perhaps very strong indication of how things can change very, very quickly. The political mood of the people can change. And in fact, we're beginning to pick up on the national scale polling that our organization and other organizations have been doing for the last year confirms has been going on even longer in California. It's very clear that the people of California want to see a change in how their government is organized and how it operates and the deliverables that it provides, but in many cases are not sure how to get there. So your task today, as was the task that we undertook last summer at our summit, which I'm going to share with you, is to try and figure ways to channel that anger, to channel that desire, those strong feelings about where we want to go. It was also an interesting week because we had our governor and our legislative leaders in Washington, D.C. saying they had a $21 billion budget deficit and they needed $7 billion from the federal government. We can laugh about it, we can cry about it, we can criticize it, but it's a further sign of the desperate times that we're in. It also reminded me a lot, listening to them talk to federal leaders about how we talk to state leaders, and sometimes how the private sector talks to us. Passing unfunded mandates, passing on new regulations, imposing requirements, acknowledging, as in one case, I was in a briefing in the governor's office a week ago, I'm absolutely convinced the federal government owes the state of California billions of dollars after that briefing in reimbursements for Medicaid expenses. It's incurred because they should have been paid by the federal Medicare system. Are we going to get it? Probably not, because the federal government would rather spend its money on other priorities than making California whole. So the dysfunction goes up and down the system. It unites us as Californians, as Americans, and we all have to pull together to try and deal with it. Meanwhile, on a personal note, to show you how weird the world is or how interesting it is, I was up till 1 a.m. this morning talking to my wife in India, trying to figure out how to get her on a plane back here because we have a family emergency she needed to get back for. That's half a world away. And I had a better connection with her via the internet and by a cell phone than I sometimes have in California. And we're going to get her back tomorrow, is the good news. But so all these things are going on. And we're here today, however, to talk about our state and our community governments and how we can make them stronger. We started as an organization, that is the City-County School Partnership, in 1997 to try and find ways to help cities and counties and schools pull together. The League's been a sponsor since then. We've been very, very proud to be involved in the organization. But over a year ago, we knew that the opening for reform was going to be coming up, and we wanted, as three organizations through the partnership, to work together to try and advance reforms that will better California and which will strengthen local government. We were united in a number of other respects. We were united in the belief that there's too much state control in our current system. That if you think back about what's happened over the last 40 to 50 years, as state government has gotten larger and taken a more dominant role in our life, it's not surprising today that it's very hard to manage that system, it's very hard to fund that system, and it's very hard to hold it accountable. But we're all also united in this idea that we want to help rebuild our state. We don't want to tear it down. We feel it's important that we pull together to do it. So we thought, rather than sit around as a task force of about, and Diane was part of that task force, thanks very much, and still is, rather than sit around as a task force, let's convene a meeting of our colleagues from around the state and get their ideas. And that's what led to the summit. We brought in 500 city, county, and school officials to begin tackling this task and to take their temperature. And you know what? You may not be aware of this. A lot of us weren't. There are 7,930 elected school, county, and city officials in our state. There are 121 elected state officials, not counting the constitutional officers, the governor, the legislature. We have a few elected constitutional officers. The Attorney General, whom you may have read, was governor again last week when the governor was out of town, and the controller and the other constitutional officers. But that is quite a startling comparison if you think about it. That gives you an idea of how important the local elected officials are in the lives of the people of our state and how the services really do get delivered at that level. But somewhere along the way, as more authority has shifted to the state level, we've seen the locally elected officials' power and, more importantly, their ability to respond to the needs of their communities compromised. So I often, when I think about this, I think about that book. If you remember Robert Reich, who was the Secretary of Labor, he wrote a book called Locked in the Cabinet after he left the Clinton administration. And that's sort of my mental picture, and that is we have some really, really good people in state government today, whether it's in the executive branch or the legislative branch, people who are elected, people who staff, and they are locked in what is probably the most dysfunctional system of government you've ever heard of. You're going to hear in a little bit from Fred Silva about our marvelous budgeting system and how it's evolved. It is absolutely critical that we figure out ways to help modernize this system and to make it more effective, because our future is all at stake. Before the summit, our task force framed a series of principles, and we started with a preamble. And I think you should feel free to either embrace, modify, or reject this preamble, but you'll see it in your materials. And that's the simple statement that California government is broken. Now, that may not seem radical today, but there's some people who do not believe that. But anyone who interfaces with it on a regular basis, like those of us at the League and elsewhere, really, really know that it is fundamentally broken. We felt we should really identify the elephant in the room, just at the outset, and throw it out there and see if people agreed. So I would urge you to talk about even that kind of a broad concept as well as the more narrow kinds of specific reforms. At our summit, the one in July, we didn't find anybody who disagreed. In fact, one of the more enlightening and at times entertaining aspects of the meetings is we let people post Twitter comments, you know, these things called tweets. Does anybody here tweet in the room? Come on, you do. Yes, you do. You know you do. Thank you. And they were able to post them on the screen, and I've got the list here if anybody wants to look at them. But fascinating comments that would suggest in many cases that we weren't being radical enough in our reaction to the dysfunction in the state government, and it just built on itself. You'll also see in that statement a phrase that I think is very telling about where we were. It simply says, "Some say politics has failed us. Others focus on the structure of government." Sometimes we get locked in those kinds of discussions, and the institutional rules. Whatever the perspective, it is clear that there must be a new and a better way of governing our large, complex state. So that's the kind of dialogue that we engaged in. We said that we believe at the outset that local governments are key to the solution, whatever it ends up being. While we need a more effective state government, we don't need a more omnipresent, a more omnipotent state government. In fact, the solution may be to go maybe from that movie, what was it called, where they said you need to go back to the future? Is that what the movie was called? That we need to reinvent our governmental system and redistribute authority and accountability so it rests where it's as close as possible to the people. Now, obviously, we have a bias about this. We have to acknowledge that. There is a very proper role for the state to play in our system, as there is for the federal role. But when we're talking about designing a government for the 21st century, which we're already a decade into, we need to ask, in this world where I can talk to my wife and email her and text her half a world away in literally seconds, what kind of government do you need to have to complement that level of technology? And is it perhaps an opening for a rethinking of the role of local government in our lives and a way to strengthen it so it actually complements the kind of global living that we're doing, as opposed to having a bigger and bigger and more omnipotent state government? So with this theme of rebuilding California from the ground up and focusing on the fact that we're nonpartisan, unlike the legislature, which is deeply partisan and deeply divided. I was thinking about Rich Gordon, who a San Mateo supervisor who's now running for the legislature, and he was asked recently by a group that was, he was asking for their endorsement, and he talked about this partisan divide and how bitter it is. And they said, what's the first thing you'll do to address it? Rich is the current chair of CCS, by the way. And he said, you know, I don't have a whole lot of solutions, but maybe the first thing I'll do is get rid of the aisle. Does anybody here, I know Fred does anybody here remember the days when Republicans and Democrats sat next to each other on the floor of the legislature and they weren't told, except for a few things, they couldn't vote for stuff? That's the way, it is possible to have a legislature that functions that way, where people not only sit together on the floor, but they actually are friends. They go out to dinner, they care about each other's families, the kinds of things you do on your councils. You build personal relationships. Today, it's very hard to do that at the state level. So we asked our delegates to look at a series of principles that you had shared with you today, but we wanted to frame it beyond the preamble. The first 5 of those principles focus on reforms that will build stronger local governments and local control. Again, we wanted to test these. We didn't want to say we had the answers, or we had the solutions. We were excited about discussing these ideas, and the discussions were great. They included reforms like greater control over our revenues and personnel and limits on state preemption and mandates. Radical thoughts. Think about this concept. You'll see it in your materials. We ought to presume that local control is the way we ought to do things unless there is a very significant reason to preempt local control. A presumption that local decision-making is better. It's not built into our system today. We don't see any evidence of it. I would urge you to test that and discuss it among each other. Where state funding has to be an important ingredient in the process, as it often is, certainly is for schools and counties, we suggested it should focus on outcomes rather than the minutiae of how you get the job done. If we look at how schools and counties in particular have to run their programs, they are absolutely dominated by this omnipresent state government and all the rules. The last 4 principles focus on the state and ideas for how we can modernize the state, whether it's like the budget process by having a 2-year budget, sunsetting of ineffective programs, looking at how the legislature operates, looking at issues like term limits. I was on the plane the other day. I was sitting next to a surgeon, very smart guy. He said to me, he asked me what I did for a living, and I told him, he says, you know, your head should really be bleeding. Why isn't it? And I said, it's internal bleeding. You just can't see it. I have to deal with all this stuff all the time. He says, you know, I just want to tell you something. You work with all those elected officials. I never vote to re-elect an incumbent. That's my rule. And I said, let me give you a good reason why that's stupid. I said, do you remember the year 2000? He says, yeah. Do you remember what happened to our electricity system? He says, yes. I said, do you realize that in the year 2000, when the energy deregulation system imploded and Enron was extorting everything they could from the people of California, only about 6 people in the legislature even knew how electricity was generated, much less knew how we got this crazy, crazy system? He said, no, I had no idea. You know, why is it that we want experienced surgeons, but we don't want experienced elected officials? You know, I would urge you to spend some time talking about that, but most of you are elected, so you may be biased there. We also saw some themes emerge from the summit, and things like the roles and responsibilities of state and local government need to be more clearly defined. I think all of us hunger for that. Local governments need sovereignty on budget matters, including protection, as I said, against unfunded state mandates. The state and local budget cycles need to be aligned. I mean, how many of us no sooner get our budget done and the state takes money from us and we have to redo the budget? It's crazy. No one would design this system and think that the way it is today and think that it works well for all of us. The whole issue of efficiency and accountability. Where can we be most efficient and most accountable at the state or the local level? And this whole issue of trust in our relationship with the electorate. Listen, our polling tells us that the people of California are like all Americans. They just distrust government. It's part of our heritage as Americans, let's be honest. But they distrust the higher levels of government much more because they're farther away. They can't hold them accountable. The most important relationship they have with government, everybody has with government, is with the local government, the people who maintain their streets, educate their kids, and deliver their basic health and other services to their families. So it's our advantage, it's also our responsibility, but it's not too well understood how strong that bond is. You understand it because you live it and breathe it. But folks at other levels of government don't always understand it. If they came from local government, as you know, you will often hear, you work where the rubber hits the road. In many ways, they envy the relationship you have with the electorate. They're in awe of it because they will never come close to it. They operate in these rooms. They hardly ever talk to citizens. You are fortunate you get to do that. We also, at the end of the meeting, asked people to give us sort of a gut check about what they thought was most important. So everybody picked 3 priorities. And I just wanted to share these with you. 51% of the 3 votes were cast about protecting local revenue sources, saying that was most important. 22% of them said we needed to reform term limits. 14% we need to be able to approve local taxes with less than 2/3 vote. And finally, 13% said requiring new funding sources for statewide ballot measures should be required. You shouldn't be able to pass a ballot measure without saying how you're going to pay for it. You'll see some of these ideas in some of the reforms that are emerging today. So that's the sort of general way we planned the summit, the way we undertook it, the kind of energy that came out of it, and the general priorities that emerged. But that being said, there were many, many reforms that were discussed. People are very excited. There was also a lot of disagreement. Not everybody felt comfortable with approving taxes by a simple majority or 55%. Not everybody wanted the legislature to be able to pass the budget with a simple majority, but a lot of people did. Not everybody felt comfortable with just focusing on one thing or the other, but there was a growing sense that we are probably the most important part of the solution to the problem facing our state. And so I'm delighted that you're here today and that you want to be part of the solution to this problem. I think you're going to be extremely successful, whatever you come up with, and we're just honored to be part of this whole program. Thank you very much.